Long time no see, Nancy. How's Jacob doing? I asked.
Well, no one has come by today.
Nancy replied. Upon hearing that her husband James and son Jacob were not at Nancy's as expected, Linda felt a rush of panic. I quickly called my husband. Where are you and Jacob right now?
We're at my parents' place. Didn't I tell you we were visiting?
James responded. Hearing this, I used my phone's GPS to check Jacob's location, only to discover he was somewhere completely unexpected. I could not forgive my husband for putting my son through this ordeal. Determined, I resolved to end my life with my husband. I'm Linda, 33 years old, living with my husband, James, and our son, Jacob, making up our family of 3. James runs a beauty salon and has a bit of a tendency to show off, yet he's also someone with a kind heart who can't say no when asked for help. Our son Jacob, still in his clingy phase, just started elementary school this year. He's a conscientious kid who takes his promises seriously. On the surface, we might seem like a typical family without any apparent issues, but the reality is quite different. This all began 2 years ago. Back then, I was a full-time homemaker, and on that day, after playing in the park with Jacob, I returned home to find an unfamiliar man standing at our doorstep. He introduced himself as a friend of James. When I informed him that James was at work and not home, he relayed to me a shocking story. To verify the truth, I decided to wait until nightfall, after putting our young son to bed, to confront James upon his return.
I'm home. Work was hectic today. Didn't even get a chance to grab lunch.
James said nonchalantly as he returned home. A man, who claims to be your acquaintance, came by our house today. I informed him while he rummaged through the refrigerator. He told me that you've accumulated a debt of about $10,000, and he has become the guarantor for it. I continued. Hearing this, James twitched but tried to maintain his composure. The repayment of that $10,000 has been delayed recently, and the guarantor received a notice for payment. That is why he was so anxious to meet you. I pressed on. Looking at James, I persisted. What is this $10,000 debt about? As I finished my question, James kneeled down, apologizing profusely. What did you spend $10,000 on? I demanded.
I went drinking with friends and ended up covering the costs for some people we met, and it just added up to that amount.
He confessed. To think that he incurred such a debt just from socializing and spending recklessly. Then, how does the guarantor know our home? I questioned further.
He is the one I met at the bar we frequently visit, and I have often bought him drinks.
James explained. It seemed as though he believed his debt would be forgiven, beginning to speak more freely. Apparently, he had been drinking on a tab at the bar and had to borrow money to settle that account. James realizes he needs a co-signer on a financial contract, and after a few drinks, impulsively asks a friend for help. His friend ended up finding out his home address when he had to show his driver's license as identification. Do you have any savings from before we got married? Maybe we can use that to reduce some of our debt. I said this, and my tone was a mix of my concern and practicality. My words caused James' previously calm demeanor to crumble, and his face became a canvas of panic and sweat. Looks like James was hiding something else. James, if you have more secrets, it's best to reveal them all now. I urged in a strong voice, but with a mixture of hope and fear in her voice. James, who had been silent at first, seemed to finally accept his situation and began to open up, albeit hesitantly.
I used my savings for various expenses, such as going out and buying clothes. The rest.
He stepped back, regret laced in his voice. Then what else? My patience was wearing thin, so I took a closer look. James revealed his sad truth in a voice so quiet it almost disappeared.
I thought I could borrow some of Jacob's savings and turn it into cash quickly.
He admitted it, but the weight of the confession was clear. Did you use Jacob's savings? My voice rose, a storm of shock and anger rising within me. Savings were Jacob's nest egg for the future, set aside from birth and filled with financial gifts on birthdays and other milestones. Why are you spending my child's money? My emotions were a mixture of disbelief and sadness, and I burst into tears as my emotions exploded. I cannot be with someone who uses my son's funds irresponsibly. We are moving toward divorce. I declared that her decision was firm.
No, divorce is not what I want. Please find another way.
James begged in a desperate voice. Just then, the door opened and Jacob came in, awake from his sleep.
Mom, what's wrong? Why are you crying?
He asked in a young voice full of anxiety. It's nothing. Please go back to sleep. I'm sorry for waking you up. I hugged and comforted my son, even though my heart felt heavy. I decided that it was in my own best interest for me to leave the house and have a serious talk with Jacob, so the next day I left the house so that Jacob could stay with my parents. I made arrangements. James expressed his strong desire to avoid divorce, regretted his own actions, and promised to repay both his debts and wasted savings.
I can't stand the thought of divorce, especially how it will affect Jacob.
James reasoned that his concern for his son was obvious. I was caught up in a whirlwind of her emotions. I pondered the possibility of my forgiveness and my own influence on Jacob. After much consideration, I accepts James' plea and chooses to work together to repair my broken relationship. When my husband began repaying his debts, our lifestyle had to change. I insisted that he commit to sharing the responsibilities of household chores and childcare, and I decided to return to work. For a few months after I resumed working, my husband was proactive with household tasks. But soon, his enthusiasm waned, and I found myself burdened with both work and home duties. I thought today was your turn to do the chores. I'll help, so let's clean up together, I would say. Yet, he would just give a nonchalant laugh and apologize, contributing little to the actual work. My only consolation was that on his days off, he invariably took our son out, showing some fatherly care. I reasoned that if he treasured time with our son, I could overlook his neglect of household chores. Recently, however, I noticed a change. Our son seemed less cheerful after outings with his father. He would only say,
I had fun,
whenever I asked about their time together, prompting me to decide to observe the situation for a while without probing too deeply. Days later, as the summer vacation began, a family outing became a topic of discussion.
I want to visit Grandpa's house,
He expressed, eagerly anticipating our trips to the rural home where he cherished playing in the river with his grandfather. This summer, we'll stay at Grandpa's. I will contact your grandparents to let them know we're coming, I said, seeing my son's joy. Unexpectedly, work commitments arose on the eve of our trip, preventing me from joining them. I'm sorry, I can't get away from work, and we won't be able to go together. I apologized to my son, who tried to hide his disappointment by saying,
It's okay.
My husband added.
If it's work, it can't be helped. I'll explain to Mom over the phone.
On the day of their departure, I sent off my husband and son, then headed to work as usual. Returning home that night, feeling the emptiness of a house without my son, I decided to call my in-laws. Good evening, I'm just calling to say my husband and son are visiting you today, I started. After a pause, she revealed.
Actually, they have not come here. James called yesterday to say the visit was cancelled because you couldn't make it.
Confused and worried, I decided to call Nancy back later and hung up. Feeling increasingly worried, I decided to contact her husband to better understand the situation. Hey, where are you now?
Of course I'm at my parents' house.
Oh, really? Can Jacob answer the phone?
Well, Jacob is busy playing video games right now, so could you wait until he's done? He'll call you back then,
He said before abruptly hanging up. I was surprised to hear that he was home, but didn't give any details. Wondering where my husband and my son are, I decided to check my son's GPS tracker. This is something I took as a precaution when my son started school. To his relief, his tracker pointed him to a local park where he used to play. I was worried about my safety, so I immediately informed my in-laws and rushed to the park. The park was large enough to host a baseball game, reflecting its openness as a community space. I started looking for him, calling his name. Jacob! Where are you? Then I saw him sitting on the swing. He noticed me and ran towards me crying.
Mom,
Jacob, are you okay?
I'm sorry, Mom.
Jacob, it's okay, now. What happened to Daddy?
We were just playing here, but Daddy had to go out for urgent business, so he asked me to wait here. When Daddy takes me, I always wait here by myself. I feel really lonely, but I promised not to tell Daddy.
Why did you promise not to tell me? He said this while holding back tears.
Daddy thought you would be sad and cry, so he decided to keep it a secret from you.
My son cried as he said this. He admitted that he had broken his promise to his father, James, to protect me from grief. Suddenly, Nancy and Thomas arrive. We thought James and Jacob would be spending the day at your house. But Jacob was really looking forward to the outing, especially the chance to play in the park.
James called me and said he couldn't carry out his plan because of Linda's work schedule.
I think that's his lie. I don't know why. Then his son spoke to him.
Dad wasn't going to Grandpa's house today, so I told him we should play at the park, but he told me to wait here because he had something to do, so I was left alone. I waited there. I was there.
Then his expression changed to a brighter shade and he continued.
Dad didn't come, but Mom came to pick me up, so I'm okay now.
Thomas exclaimed in disbelief, his face white with anger and the atmosphere tense.
How could James leave such a young child alone in the park? Where the heck was he?
Nancy shared his anger and her words were sharp with reproach.
I can't believe he put Jacob through this. James is disqualified as his father.
In the midst of these heated exchanges, Jacob's absence was so conspicuous that as the night wore on, I had to ask Nancy to take me to her house to comfort him. Later, Thomas and I found ourselves holding a silent vigil in the park, the silence punctuated by our shared concern for James, who was conspicuously absent. I said to myself as I searched the park for any sign of him. When will he be back? Then I saw a couple sitting on a bench in the distance, hugging each other. Thomas lunged towards the couple with a sudden violent movement, and his sudden outburst shattered the calm of the night. As I stood there trying to make sense of the chaos, I realized that the man in the midst of it all was James.
What are you doing here?
James' plea cut through the tension. He yells as he grabs the man. Thomas pulled the man's arm and headed towards him. A woman follows him while making a fuss. I stood there, not knowing what was happening, but when I looked closer, I saw that the man was her husband.
Dad, please stop.
James, right here and now. You owe us a full explanation.
Thomas's voice was a mixture of anger and despair. Their fight quickly escalated until James lost his balance and fell at my feet. James looked up at me, Linda, with a puzzled expression.
Why are you here, Linda? Hey, where is Jacob?
I asked Nancy to take Jacob to your family's place. He was supposed to stay there tonight, right? Realizing the situation, James started to explain.
Well, that was the plan. But Jacob suddenly wanted to go to the park, so I had no choice but to bring him here.
But why was Jacob playing alone?
Well, I got a sudden work call.
Before he could finish, the young woman with him, Jessica, interjected.
What are you hiding? It didn't work. We've been alone in a hotel the whole time. Just tell her the truth.
As she said this, Jessica clung to James. Are you two actually on a relationship? Faced with the question, James turned pale, while Jessica's face lit up with joy.
Yes, we are together. That's why, Linda, you and James should get a divorce soon.
James, what do you want to do? I asked my husband. After a moment of thought, James replied in a soft voice.
I don't want a divorce.
Hearing this, my face turned ashen, and I silently stared at James. Well, I've decided to divorce you. I recounted to Thomas the events of 2 years ago. I can't live with a man who has created debt for his family and even dipped into Jacob's savings. Hearing this, Thomas trembled with anger.
What debt? I lent you $10,000 2 years ago. Have you been borrowing more than that?
Faced with the question, James defiantly admitted.
Yes, what's wrong with being in debt? I want to live freely.
Do you think this debt is justified?
Yes, I'm just asserting my rights. Even Jacob's savings came from gifts, right? Since he's my son, I have the right to use half of that money. It's outrageous that you saved all of it.
James's rant continued unabated.
Even my father's money will eventually become mine. It's just a matter of time. Money should be spent to have any value. If it's just sitting there, give it all to me.
Even after finishing, James's agitation did not subside. Watching quietly, Thomas finally spoke.
I never thought you thought of your parents' money that way. I'm cutting ties with you as a parent and child.
After telling my husband, Thomas leaves. What you did is unforgivable. I will make sure that you pay for your affair and Jacob's savings through legal means.
A lawsuit? That's ridiculous. I won't pay a dime.
Ignoring James's abuse, Linda leaves determined to seek her justice. A few days later, I contacted my lawyer and filed for my divorce, and I requested child support and alimony, including compensation from Jacob's depleted savings. The lawsuit also targets James' mistress Jessica, who is seeking compensation for the affair. Everything went smoothly and I was very relieved. I later learned from Nancy that after I divorced, James admitted that he could not afford to pay his alimony to me. He even took over Jessica's debts. However, Jessica soon disappears without a trace, leaving James even more in debt with her. Although he continued to work, he was unable to keep up with his repayments and eventually asked his parents for help, but they disowned him. Well, I quit my full-time job to be with Jacob, and I only worked part-time during the day. Although I could not be called luxurious as I lived on child support, alimony, and a meager income, the quality time I spent with Jacob filled my life with joy. Jacob was once reluctant to visit the park after the tumultuous days, but recently expressed interest in going again with me. Still, she knew that his emotional wounds had not completely healed. I vowed that I would create lasting, positive memories with Jacob and make sure his heart was filled with happiness.